I mean, the thing is like, that's it. We're not uprising-ists. We're revolutionaries. The point is to create revolution, not just to create an uprising, a rebellion, whatever. It's to create a moment where the communist necessity is realized.
Hello!
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left on Red. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
We're simply two guys retraining our brains 24 hours a day to have one thought in mind. If you're waiting for me to specify the thought, you should already know.
Yes. Speaking of this episode, we have read The Communist Necessity by J. Moufawad-Paul.
Yeah, J. Moufawad-Paul. Do you know what his first name actually is? I think it's Joseph.
I think that's right, yes. Sorry, I went on a little journey there. I Googled his name at one point because I was looking at his other books. I wanted to see his whole bibliography because I liked this book and I was thinking about getting one of his other books. And I had a weird little thing where for some reason, when I Googled his name, a picture of Moufawad-Paul came up and I was like, wait a minute.
It's because he does an interview. Yeah. He has an interview with him.
Which makes sense because they're both MLMs.
Yeah, I watched a few of them earlier, a few of his interviews earlier, just to kind of get some background on him.
Okay.
Which I will now divulge. J. Moufawad-Paul, he's from Canada, and he was actually radicalized in the 90s and 2000s. You know, very obvious if you have read this book, kind of where his aim is pointed at, but he was kind of radicalized during that Occupy movement, right? He saw that happen, and the person that he says is responsible for was actually his wife for his radicalization, which I think is very adorable. But since then, he's written numerous books about the modern Maoist perspective. Something he definitely holds is that an anti-revisionist standpoint, which is something that he says we all need to get more anti-revisionist immediately, right now.
Exercise revisionism from your brain.
Yeah, but, you know, he's published with Chris Plebedeb, Zero Books, and a couple of other publications. He's still writing today. So, The Communist Necessity, that's what we read.
Yeah.
This was his first book published in 2014.
Yeah, it was published in 2014, and then the version that we have was published in 2020 with a new afterword, kind of a coda from Paul, which is interesting to see his reflections, you know, say 6 years later. And yeah, this version is from Chris Plebedeb, and what do you call it? The blurb on the back, I think, is a pretty good summation of what the book is. 5 years ago, The Communist Necessity was written to demarcate a revolutionary politics grounded in necessity from social movementism and revolutionary science from contemporary intellectual fads. Now, J. Moufawad-Paul's notorious polemic is back, still relevant and prescient. So, yeah, I wanted to read this some time ago when we were, I guess it was around the time that we also got Socialist Reconstruction. I got this book because I was thinking very much about the application of Marxism-Leninism in the Western world in the modern day. And I was trying to look for texts that were contemporary that maybe shed some light on that and would help me in my development, me in my thinking. And I picked this up. It sat on the bookshelf forever. And then, like I alluded to in the last episode, one day I had like 5 minutes before I had to leave somewhere, and I was just standing around doing nothing, being anxious like I do before I have to do anything. And so I pulled it off the shelf and I read the introduction, and it really blew me away. So I was really looking forward to reading this, and it didn't disappoint. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, don't get me wrong. I thought it was fantastic. It's got that same kind of call to action that I felt when we read Blood in My Eye, honestly. It's not as like outwardly violent or striking, maybe. But there's something about the necessity that Moufawad-Paul talks about. I'm just going to end up calling him Paul this whole episode. Sorry, first half of your name. It's the necessity of it that's really the thing. Like, we have expressed on this podcast the idea of maybe a platonic communism, right? Like an ideal communism in the future, some distant horizon. And that's something that Paul really rails against in this piece. And I think that it doesn't alleviate any of my depression of the current moment, but it does reinforce the fact that this kind of movement is necessary and it's immediate. That same kind of immediacy is what I think I was feeling in connection to like when we read Blood in My Eye. And the difference here is that this is a modern book. This is a book that is post-collapse of actually existing socialism as it was known. And I think that really adds to it something that is particularly striking. You know, I don't want to say that it feels almost like chastising. It's polemical, I guess, is the best way to put that. But a lot of it really still leaves me with that same kind of void. You know, it's a lot of the questions that I had when we really started this, which was like, is the answer another party? If so, then what? then like, what's the fucking move, right? Something that, just to talk about in the coda, in the afterword actually, something that was really interesting to me. He says on 164, since I wrote The Communist Necessity, I have encountered readers whose main takeaway was only, quote, get involved with the Communist Party, unquote, and who were less concerned about judging the efficacy of this or that communist project, right? And that's kind of really where I still stand, because just like I was saying, right, if the answer is another party, then where is the party? Where does that party come from? Is it required that we build it? I know that leads directly into Paul's argument of the communist horizon, like somebody else will build the party and we are just waiting for it to arise, but it doesn't alleviate any of that pressure. It doesn't alleviate any of that depression.
Yeah, I knew we were going to get into this, and it sounds like we're of a like mind there. That quote that you read, he continues by saying the problem posed by movementism is not solved by joining a revisionist project. And that got me thinking a lot about a refrain you hear pretty commonly now is like, an imperfect party is better than no party,
Yeah.
And I think he would disagree with that notion.
See, I think that, I don't know if I agree with that, because I think that there's so many ways in which he talks about the party as a process in here, and I think that he would much rather build an imperfect party than, I mean, because I think that there's times where he references the idea of this movementist idea that previous revolutions failed because they didn't adhere to the party line. And he says, ultimately, that's exactly what Trotsky was saying. It's like that same kind of puritanical idea that has already failed us in the previous building of revolutionary movements, and so it's just not as black and white. And I think that Paul is happy to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
He's much more about building the party and reckoning with those last failures than trying to even say, like, we need to start anew. I guess that's really the problem with my question, is that when we're starting a new party, quote unquote, it's not anything new.
It's rich with the history of many past revolutions.
Right. And the context of that, like trying to build something new, quote unquote, in the context of, all of these old parties and organizations that linger or exist within the context of the current situation that we're in, but, aren't necessarily revolutionary, all of these things. I mean, he talks about economism in here. He talks about trade unions. He talks about so much. And ultimately, it kind of feels like that. Just fucking put your boots on the ground, man. Roll up your sleeves and get to work, brother. And I know that's not what he's saying. Like, obviously he's not, but it's a bit of a diagnosis without a cure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, okay, I have two thoughts in response to that. One response is really framed as a question, which is one of the questions I was left with after reading this, which is, who is the vanguard party in the Western world of the 21st century? Because I think a quote-unquote return or expectation that it go back to a previous vanguard is misguided. But my answer to the question is still completely unknown then. Like, where is that vanguard going to come from?
Right.
And that got me thinking a lot about, it's actually near the very end of the book where he's being polemical against someone. He's talking about the WTO protests, which for anyone my age was a radicalizing moment for a lot of folks and was like a kind of watershed moment for radical politics. That was around the time of my political enlightenment and the start of my journey on radicalization. I wasn't there, obviously. I was 16 years old, but I did know people that were there and got beat up, and that was a big part of the discourse back then. He's talking about leading up to Seattle there, and on 140, those who spoke of refusing to take power of some new movement that could spontaneously end capitalism upon reaching a critical mass and of the political fantasy described in We Are Everywhere would have eschewed the word communism, since it stank of failure and totalitarianism and everything they were taught to despise in bourgeois high school textbooks. Now, the word communism is being spoken into these spaces, and though a forbidding name, those who speak it are attempting to reconfigure the concept. Even the invisible committee that imagines its own fantastical horizon of a coming insurrection without a Leninist party has remobilized the word communism when only decades earlier, the same people would have been made anxious whenever it was spoken. My complete ignorance of the invisible committee aside, what that got me thinking a lot about is this weird tension, dialectical, I guess, where people have to have room to grow and develop politically. So we have to have some amount of space for people that are uncomfortable with the word communism or something like that, or sink into their kind of bourgeois historicism of totalitarianism, whatever the fuck that means.
Yeah.
And leave space for educating those masses and welcoming them into organizational spaces, but not for the vanguard. You know, so that's where the distinction is there. That's where the tension is the vanguard needs to be, I don't know that I would call it Trotskyist, but that pure political line.
Well, okay, I think that I see your point, but I think that the distinction is that that's the role of the vanguard party, right? It's not that it's a pure line necessarily, but it's a scientific one, you know, like it's one that is forged and reforged, you know, through self-criticism, or I almost said like criticism sessions or whatever. But
let's have a quick rap session.
Right. So I don't think that it's necessarily about like we come up with the perfect theoretical line, and then that's what the vanguard party holds. When people subjugate themselves to that line, they're let into the party. But it is that in a sense, because that's what the Leninist model is describing, you know. But even in the past, when we've thought about the Leninist model, we've still held in mind something that is ultimately putschist, you know, something that's ultimately Blanquist, as he says here, right? A small, closed-off intellectual elite that will then lead, essentially, an insurrection, right? It'll seize power. I think that that's a bit of a vulgarization of the Leninist model at the core, because I think that what they're saying is that it's about a mass party, you know, like it's about a party that does involve the masses. And to extend that further to something like Mao, to Mao think, the mass line is ultimately where the line comes from, you know? So it's about like meeting the masses where they are, and it's about creating a point of revolutionary unity that still doesn't subjugate your political line at the end of the day. I mean, that's what he says so beautifully on 133. The history of successful or nearly successful revolutions and people's wars are instances in which revolutionary unity, however temporarily, was actually built. This is a passage radiating multiple necessities, the most important of which is communism, right? And it's like we've talked about before, where people need to understand that their survival is linked with the destruction of class society as it stands, especially in the centers of capitalism, as Paul says. We're not necessarily affected by that nightmare in the same way. Right, he says that it's not a nightmare in the city centers; it's more of a fever dream. Whereas on the in the other parts of the world, capitalism is experienced as more of a nightmare.
Yeah,
you know, and so like the role of the masses in that is about understanding that necessity. It's not necessarily about complete subjugation to the party line. It's simply about building that moment of unity around that necessity, because the dissolution of the class structure—that's the goal there, and that's almost close to that kind of horizon thing. There's that part where he even says, like, the conservative communists might just be like, well, obviously all we need to do is build a unity between the proletariat and overthrow the classes, right? And he's saying, like, that's a slogan that is always about the last instance. And, like, we have to be wary of the fact that the last instance may never come. I think that's Althusser that he's quoting there. But it's still about creating the conditions for that necessity to be realized. I mean, that's what he's saying class consciousness is, ultimately, is the acceptance of that as a necessity, not just a possibility, not just a contingency, but a necessity.
Yes, I agree with all of that. I feel like something's getting lost in the sauce here. Maybe I've misrepresented my position a little bit about the vanguard, I mean. Because I would agree, like he says on 134, to speak of a communist necessity is also to speak in every particular situation in which a universalized communist theory might be articulated of concrete praxis. And he continues at the bottom of that page, a single revolutionary program that emerges from a concrete analysis of a concrete situation on behalf of a dynamic movement is worth more than 1,000 academic Marxist books or 1,000 eclectic neo-communist theories. And so when I said politically pure, I didn't mean it in, like you said, the characterization of the Leninist model as like a closed-off group of elites leading the masses unconnected or whatever. I don't think it works like that either. I think I would fall into Mao think there, I guess, and that I think that's where the mass line comes in, because the vanguard needs to be connected to the people to understand the real situation, understand the plight of the people. But the little note that I wrote to myself here, with regard to that, theory and praxis must work in concert. One without the other is futile and will never build to the necessary revolution. And theory must come from the testing ground of class struggle. It cannot come from on high, as it will always be abstract platitudes that mean nothing in the trenches. And then likewise, praxis without theory becomes ameliorative mutual aid that burns out everyone endlessly grinding against the machine. So there is a balance there that keeps the vanguard party connected, but they are the ones holding the political line, even if it is a dynamic line in response to the people. I don't know. I just feel like there is a distinction there that's important that doesn't create this conception of the vanguard as somehow separate or elite, hierarchical in that way.
I think that a part of that problem is coming from the fact that we are thinking of it as new.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is the case. Like, given the context of, say, building a party, then that is much more at the front. Because, like, it's easy to imagine, like, thinking about the Bolsheviks, even though they weren't necessarily a majority, they still had a significant portion of the population. In that way, it was much easier for us to imagine them leading the charge because they were already such a significant portion of the population. When we're thinking about the context of, say, like the US now, where we're saying like all of these are not necessarily parties that we're saying are going to do the job, so thus the solution is to make your own. Thinking about building it from the ground up, right, from scratch, it's much more worrying to think about the fact that your small group is separated because by definition they absolutely are. You know, I don't know what the solution for that lies, but I think that it is actually a totally important question in the current context because it's like, how do you create this party that still holds a pure principle in that sense and still also grow it, right? That's something that he says about parties from the New Left movement or the New Communist movement that still linger, that they're still rigid and cult-like, and they fail to recognize that a lack of growth is a sign of stagnation.
Yeah.
You know,
he says, is this not the rallying cry of every marginal Trotskyist group?
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, that's like exactly the thing. It's like, how do you... it's that struggle, right? How do you find the middle ground? And I don't know. Part of that conflict feels like it's because we feel so listless right now in the current context.
Yeah, I think so much of the question around it is coming from a place of desperation because it's like... Who is the vanguard party in the Western world in the 21st century? Candidates are tumbleweed crickets, you know what I mean? Like you just feel so helpless to it.
I mean, this is a question that has a partial answer already in my mind, but I guess really the thing is like, how do I evaluate current Marxist-Leninist parties? We've talked all about PSL up and down, and I can't seem to find a solid ground to view them from.
Yeah, I feel like I vacillate back and forth on them all the time.
Much the same. You know, and it's that same problem, though, because part of me is like, it's supportive of something being done. You know, it's supportive of like, this is actual movement that's happening right now. It's just ultimately a question of evaluating whether that energy is worth it. You know, as you go up the popularity of the party in question, that becomes more pertinent, you know, because I've seen a lot of people that I would consider to be anti-revisionist, and of course this is Twitter, so don't fucking, you know, I'm not fooling myself here, right? Talk about groups like FRSO, you know, as being much more pure in their line. I really don't like using the word pure here, but you know what I mean. Whereas, you know, I've seen fucking Maoists say like, hey, we're going to join DSA because it's simply the largest effective party possible right now. You know, like it's simply the thing that has the most potential movement within it. Again, it's just a part of the dire situation that we're in. But how do I actually evaluate a party based on those things? You know, is it just about reading their program and doing some critical analysis? No, I mean, it's about what they're doing on the ground, honestly, more than anything.
It sucks because even mass organizations like PSL or DSA spend so much of their time fucking spinning their wheels, getting involved in electoralism, getting involved in mutual aid projects or whatever, that's fine, I guess, but like that can't be the sole purpose of an organization exists if this is the goal that is ultimately never going to respond to the communist necessity, you know? So it's hard to look at a group and evaluate them through that lens when 95+% of their effort is not focused on that, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And to a certain degree, the little bit that does actually happen within the party, they have to rightly be on guard and be very vigilant.
Yeah.
And so it's mostly happening behind closed doors and in closed meetings, which I have a problem with for another reason, but I understand the necessity of, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I was about to say too, is like thinking about even the movements that he's saying are current and worth paying attention to, worth analysis. A lot of them are gone. RCP-PCR, it's Canadian. They're Canadian Maoists. Dissolved in 2021.
Yeah.
Followed that up a little bit later, you know. I texted you the other day about, he mentions the fact that the PCMA, the Party Communist Maoist Afghanistan, is preparing to launch People's War.
Yeah.
You know, I went and read some communiques from them, and the conclusion was still on the horizon,
yeah.
Ironically. It doesn't help that a lot of the anti-revisionist projects that he is saying are worth study have fallen into such disarray. I mean, even thinking, he lists a couple. The Shining Path in Peru. He talks about the Naxalites. He talks about, very briefly, in the Philippines, right? He talks about in Nepal, they had Maoist insurgency. They had People's War that happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
All of those places are, the Philippines, yes, the Naxalites are still going. But in Nepal, they joined the electoral process in 2006. I think he mentions it here. It's the Prachanda Path, I believe. The Shining Path essentially dissolved. Gonzalo was arrested and then died. I don't know if they still have things going on there. I mean, not to talk about other, not necessarily Maoist, but People's War adjacent things like FARC, stuff like that. I mean, it's hard to look at the trajectory of those movements and then see their application to the communist necessity in the same way, other than the fact that they are more direct and confrontational than, other movements that he puts in place. And I know that that's not exactly fair to Paul's argument here, but I don't know. Looking at revolutionary history is always really depressing, and the Maoist tendency is no exception. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. It's just that, even the vanguardist model that Paul puts forth doesn't necessarily satisfy me. And part of that may be my bourgeois indulgence, my fear of rectification, as he says, but...
Well, yeah, my kind of discomfort with that question while reading the text manifested a little bit differently. I guess I'll call to, it's the last chapter. On 143, he writes, the contradictions of the system are more apparent in the peripheries. At the centers, they are muted by a culture industry that persists only because of the most brutal exploitation and oppression elsewhere. Those who have grown up in regions such as Afghanistan have been able to live without experiencing the most direct and brutal effects of what George W. Bush once called, without irony, the task that never ends. And so that raised an interesting question in my mind, and something we've explored in the past about what is the real likelihood of revolution in the United States. The question most simply is are efforts better spent supporting revolution elsewhere rather than trying to build revolution here?
Sure.
But there is a kind of privileged tension that comes with that.
Well, Paul says no, there is certainly cracks in the beast that must be exploited by what we have going on here. And he also says that to say that kind of thing is to embrace the totality of capitalism.
Yeah.
And it denies that necessity. I mean, it relegates communism to contingency is what he says there. So... I mean, that's the same thing, man. It's just that thing where it's how much of my privilege am I willing to give up to make revolution? The answer needs to be all of it in order for this thing to actually work. Crazy to say. But people in the metropole aren't, what's it going to take for them to actually embrace that as necessity? Not just contingency, right? Because that's why I feel a lot of fucking first world revolutionaries are when the world goes to shit, that's when I'll hit the bricks. Myself not excluded. And... don't fool yourself. That's just not the case, And also waiting for that moment is waiting for a moment that's already too far gone. Something that Paul does in this book that I really, 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 really love is the fact that he is super critical of the fact that the window is closing. It's not fuck a horizon, okay? Because the window is closing. We're running out of time. Soon it will get to the point where communism will not be possible based on the material reality. We will be struggling for existence. We'll be struggling to preserve our own history. It's not some revolution out of the wasteland because the wasteland excludes the possibility. We can't wait for the wasteland. The wasteland excludes the possibility. It only makes more pressing the need for that kind of vanguard party, as he's saying. And the thing is that based on what information is available to me, I know I haven't searched that fucking hard, but it's starting to seem like one needs to be built. Fuck. And that fucking sucks.
Yeah, well, I mean...
I'm so sorry.
No, it just, I agree. It sucks because I don't feel equipped to do that.
Yeah. It ain't me. I shouldn't say that. I mean, yeah, that's how I truly feel, Part of that is my fucking privilege, but... I was just thinking about that quote where Paul says, the bourgeois love to think that they'll lead the charge, but they've never led the revolution. So maybe I just need to fucking rectify myself. Maybe I should just go support one of these groups and shut the fuck up.
Well, this is where my mind was at while reading the book, thinking again about that kind of testing ground of class struggle. Like he says, we're on the periphery of that. We're not in the center of it. We see it from afar and maybe feel the, third count effects of that. We're farther out from the realities of that nightmare. And with that in mind, not only is revolution in the West more or less possible? Is it the best use of one's energy? Considering that, like that culture industry that he talked about, does the privilege make allowance for revolution, or does the spectacle that maintains the gap between theory and practice make it less likely? It's just like, I said very early on that I've never felt like a revolutionary. I will support the Fred Hamptons of the world, but that is like a super fucking privileged position to take. But also, like, I'm not living a reality that makes it, that equips me to do much more. And that, I guess the real response is like, stop living that reality, fucking hit the mattresses, you know? But
I mean, you know, it doesn't even have to be said. It's just that, like, we're living a privileged life, you know? I mean, like, I love this book, and that discomfort is a big part of it. It's part of that immediacy I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make me feel good. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah, the comparison to Blood in My Eye is interesting because I do think it has a similar urgency, but ironically feel more defeated by this book, and I felt much more charged up by Blood in My Eye.
Well, it's because Jackson is speaking from a position of having a vanguard party. Yeah. He literally is saying the vanguard is here and we're fucking doing it. Yeah. He's made the analysis of the contradictions in the fucking class and racial society of the 60s and said, here is the vanguard party, here is the line that I need to subjugate myself to, and he's done it. You know, that same kind of line doesn't necessarily exist for us. We're still existing in this. I mean, you know, I've thought a lot about what he was saying about this tendency of this new intellectual left to grasp at all this different eclectic theory, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, in the context of just what we've been doing, like, I still hold that it's worth exploring and analyzing alternatives to mainstream communism, whatever that means. I know, so funny. But I really just think the context in which it's studied in is important, you know, because I do agree with what Paul says here. So much of this book is a polemic against the movementism of the 90s and 2000s, where he says that we'll just have small, sporadic movements and they'll join together to create, you know, he says we imagine ourselves as raindrops that would create the flood that would wash away the system. And I think that part of my willingness to explore that kind of pluralism does stem from that, you know? So it's just a question of at what point do you need to, I don't want to keep saying fucking rectify, man. It's making me feel like a dogmatist, you know? But like at what point do you really just need to nail down the line and then follow it?
You know, it's funny. There's a quote, just to pull something from the text, on 119, when a variety of organizations with competing ideologies and strategies are gathered together under one banner, the only theoretical unity that can be achieved is the most vague anti-capitalism. And what I wrote to myself was how much of Russia's success was due to strict repression of revisionists. Like, we've made jokes in the past about things like that before, and I've certainly said a flippant thing or two about just fascists. But also, you kind of just got to all the fascists, man.
I mean, and the thing is, too, is that when we talk about that kind of purges, we're still tainted by that kind of anti-communist ideology. Part of what that says is that kind of common sense anti-communist cliche. Even if what we're actually saying there is that's what I'm saying is like that joke carries with it a truth and that same kind of anti-communist ideology at the same time.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
And the problem is that like the tongue-in-cheek part of it might also carry with it that anti-communist ideology, you know what I mean? Because maybe the solution is to say with a straight face, we're going to purge all the fucking revisionists. No gulag about it. Like, that's just simply what it is. Because in the context of purges throughout the history of communism, they haven't always been exactly face the wall, take a fucking bullet, that kind of thing. A lot of times it's just, you're not doing the party work right now. Mm-hmm. You know, maybe that will change in the future. That's it. You know, the thing is that when we think about purges, we're still carrying with it that anti-communist burden. You know, we're still thinking of purges as something that maintains violence and murder and totalitarianism and all of these anti-communist common sense cliches. You know, but people that have actually subjugated themselves to this line don't think about it that way.
Yes, I think when you say we, I think you mean at large.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we just make a lot of jokes about it because it's funny, but I do think it does happen still.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And also, this is such a tangential point, but like, it's really the left talking to the left about the left.
Dude, that line.
Yeah. It's in the afterword.
Yeah, it's on 160.
Yeah. That's the thing is like that joke is for other communists. You know, when you say like you're just going to face the wall to someone that's not a communist, it's not a joke to them. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, fuck. So I think that there's a part of that that's born from irony.
Yeah, my response to that, the line is great. He says, "It's not worth doing something like this again," she informed me. It's just, this is his mentor speaking to him. Her name was Gabrielle.
Yeah, a representative from the PCR RCP.
Yeah. Talking about him speaking at a conference, doing a debate, I think he was doing. And her response to it was, "It's not worth doing something like this again," she informed me. "It's just the left talking with the left about the left. The masses aren't here."
Right.
And, I have such a weird response to that because I feel this way about all of the dumb discourse that happens, especially the anarchist communist divide. I feel this way a lot about veganism also as a part of leftist politic, but also I think that the digital realm makes this a little bit muddier. I don't think it's as easy to dismiss that sort of back and forth as not useful because the quote, "the masses aren't here." I think when you go to a conference or you're in the middle of some political organization and you're having those discussions, it's mostly pointless because the masses aren't there, right?
Yeah.
All you're doing is jerking each other off.
Sure.
But in the digital realm, those sorts of things I do think have merit in perhaps a tool of radicalization, perhaps not the sole tool, but one of many tools for education and propagandizing folks, I guess. And so I don't know. I'm not as quick to dismiss that, the left talking to the left about the left. I'm not as quick to dismiss that as it seems that he is.
I don't know. I have some complex feelings about it, mostly because I've seen all of the dumb discourse that happens between the left that the masses are exposed to, and I don't know if it's doing us any favors, to be perfectly honest. I don't think that the party lane is created on the fucking internet. I don't think that it's created in Twitter.
I agree with that.
It's not like that's a debate that's happening for any real merit. It's just happening for dumb bullshit. When you mix in also that good blend of lovely postmodern irony that we have, I don't necessarily know if it's doing any favors. And in fact, I think it might be muddying the message more than anything. I think that that's something that the internet does quite well, which is to kind of...
it pacifies people for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it makes it present and not present at the same time. It's very in your face to the point where everything can be tuned out. I think that left discourse is not excluded from that kind of thing. I don't know if it reaches the masses in any meaningful way. I don't know. It's just tough to say how much, not just Twitter and TikTok discourse. I'm not so narrow-minded here, but part of me feels like that the messaging to the masses has to be pointed in a way. It has to be constructed because so much of our current, we live in this malaise of anti-communism already. And so anything that doesn't explicitly work against those is, in a sense, aiding it because it doesn't disprove that kind of thing. And what I mean by that is, I don't know, I feel like it just needs to be more pointed. The left talking about the left with the left, it's not molded enough, I feel like, to be an effective messaging to the masses. It's not something that conveys the necessity of the moment to the masses in a way. It really does feel a little bit more circle jerky to me. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but I think perhaps where I'm seeing utility in that sort of discourse is for people like us. So maybe I'm not talking about the masses at large, but I'm talking about people that would be mobilized to organize. I think discourse that I've seen has led me toward or away from different organization in the community, which is where I think the actual party line is being developed, right? Because it's that synthesis of theory and praxis. If you're just on the internet talking about shit, you're never actually getting into it for real. But that kind of discourse is the sort of stuff that leads people to putting their boots on the ground, so to speak. On the other end of that, though, it sounds like what you're talking about, and it was making me think a lot about left-wing communism in our discussion around electoralism. And he talks about that quite a bit here, too.
Yeah.
My take on it is he's quite dismissive of electoralism, which I think from a purely theoretical standpoint makes sense. But I think my takeaway on left-wing communism was around building a party that uses the bourgeois institution of electoralism to educate the masses against that sort of bourgeois institution, right?
Yeah.
There's a quote. I'll go to 116. "We know that elections do not matter and that capitalism continues its murderous onslaught regardless of what party is in power." Agree. He continues, "But to participate in a convention we recognize as fraudulent is a bit like an unemployed biologist who pays the bills and maintains some sort of influence over their students by teaching six-day creationism at a private religious school." Which is funny, but I am, as of yet, not entirely exercised of that belief that a popular election can shift public opinion and sentiment. I cynically acknowledge that popular support doesn't equate with any form of actual reform, as evidenced by the people in the United States wanting all sorts of things to happen. We have majority popular support, but they won't happen, like universal health care, for example. But it does shift the discourse to a certain degree with the masses, does it not? I mean, we can shit on Bernie all we want, but his 2016 run did a lot, I think, to mobilize young people. And there are a lot of communists in 2026 that started as Bernie bros in 2016.
Yeah. Okay, so I do have some thoughts about this here, and it's really all coming from this page. The thing that he says about Lenin that I think is the most interesting is that we can really only accept what Lenin says about electoralism if we also accept everything else that he's saying, which is build a fucking party right now, guys.
Yeah.
Find stronger people, etc. And I agree, because I do agree with you on your point about Lenin. That's what I expressed on that episode, was that it was only useful within the context of organizing in that sense. And I think Paul is saying really the same thing here. To waste time and energy, then, in a struggle that will not move us any closer to our distant horizon is to participate in a convention we recognize as fraudulent.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I mean, even on the next paragraph, we're often only capable of struggling in those reformist spaces that the current social order considers legitimate.
Yeah.
And I think electoralism is a great example, because the moment an electoral project flies too close to the sun, it's struck down. And Bernie's the perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Bernie was quelled to the point where his movement is now purely reformist. I mean, that's literally it. Mm-hmm. And I think that electoralism will always run into that problem because it's within the confines of the structure that already exists. Just like later when he says that only liberals think it's violent to draw the lines because they already stand within the lines that are drawn. Mm-hmm. Electoralism is within the drawn lines. It doesn't necessarily serve our purpose because it's already a politic of the oppressor. I mean, it's already a politic of the convention. It's already a line that's been drawn.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I am really conflicted about that.
Yeah, well, when we read Left-Wing Communism, I said what we need is to be building a popular communist party that actually runs in elections and can actually be used in this way. And I would agree that even just at the top of the next page on 117, Paul says, in lieu of the coming insurrection lurking beyond the unapproachable horizon, and instead of building a militantly structured organizational force, we might as well busy ourselves with damage control within the framework of the current state of affairs. And I think that that's in line with what you're saying and what Lenin was saying, but I also think that presupposes the existence of that vanguard. And I don't know. I think there has to be something in there that can be useful.
I mean, yeah, I do agree, but I think at that point you just have to look at an analysis of what's actually happened. I mean, 2020 is a great fucking example because PSL did that. Was that in 2024? Am I tripping? Yeah, 2024. I am tripping.
Yeah, they ran Claudia de la Cruz.
De la Cruz? And another person who I can't remember the name of.
Some other person, yeah.
What did that do for them? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm just genuinely curious, and we'll never get the answer. But what did that actually do for them? Was the energy and money and campaigning and time and TV spots and media ads for 6% of the vote barred from the ballot in a bunch of states, including the one I fucking voted in? Was that worth anything?
That's fair. I mean, okay. Yeah.
That's an incredible example that Paul brings up in this book, is when he talks about economism, and he says, if you want a real concrete example, just look at this release from Action Québécois, where they say, we were in the trade movement struggle, we did well, we had people in positions of power, and this is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
And so I think that, what I'm thinking of is when we were talking about, I think this might have been on the Angela Davis episode, we were talking about Frederick Douglass and how he was still clinging to electoralism. And I think Angela Davis has I think we've proven that electoralism is not in our favor. So at what point do we stop wasting energy on it?
Yeah. I guess if I'm really examining my core belief, I agree with that. My attitude toward voting and electoralism now is it's worth an hour of my day.
Yeah. It's not to say I 100% agree, because it takes a second to vote and it does have potential to change, but it's not the defining thing.
Yeah, definitely that. But your point about if we're broadening that to talk more organizationally, how much time, energy, how many resources are put into an election of someone everyone involved knows isn't going to be elected, if by some miracle they were elected, be placed into a system that is already built to tear them down from the moment. I mean, the Mamdani example is obviously right on the top of everyone's mind.
Mamdani, New York. Sorry, I'm wearing a Mamdani t-shirt right now. You know what it is, man, is that to do that, I think, is to accept the totality of capitalism, especially in the American system. You put yourself forth as the loser already. You say, I'm the third party in a scenario where everyone has already been conditioned to ignore the third party. You're saying, ignore me. You know, I don't see value in that. I mean, like, if we were talking about someplace with proportional representation, sure, you know, how there's like fucking 3 communists on the Dutch parliament or some shit like that. Whatever, cool. Maybe there's more potential there. But in the American system, I don't think there is.
Yeah.
You know, you relegate yourself to the dustbin when you run third party. You know, and that happens so much that people accuse Jill Stein of being a fucking Fed for doing it.
Yeah.
You know, where's Jill Stein? We got to wait for the next election to hear about her again.
I wonder what Butch Ware would have to say about all of this.
You know what I loved is, right here. It's actually on 118. Indeed, those old communist parties that still run candidates in various elections do not recognize the contradiction of their practice. They have various rhetorical strategies and dogmas that allow them to believe that they are engaged in revolutionary practice and represent the will of the proletariat. One only needs to argue for an hour with an average member of the Communist Party USA or Communist Party of Canada or Communist Party of India, parentheses Marxist, or any similar organization to realize that this is the case. They will accuse you of being a counter-revolutionary and in league with the bourgeoisie. Right, mainly because you're challenging the political direction.
Yeah.
But like the fucking, I don't know if he was the chairman or what, but like one of the Communist Party USA guys went on The Daily Show to talk about how Mamdani wasn't actually a communist. And it's like, what are you serving with that? Do you think that that's bringing revolution to the masses when you do that? I don't think so. I actually think it might be the opposite.
Yeah.
You know, I think you might be relegating yourself to a laugh.
I didn't feel great after reading this book, and I feel even worse now.
If you are a member of the Vanguard Party, you can reach us at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
We should talk about movementism, because we've talked around it, so let's talk about it. Okay, if I'm going to throw something out there to get us started, it's very clear that he is responding to the kind of movementism of the 90s, the aughts, that he was coming up in politically. And I think I have a quote that I would pull out that I think does a pretty good job of encapsulating that. It's on page 36. Placing their faith in disorganized rebellions, they argue either explicitly or implicitly that we must tail every unfocused mass protest that erupts in response to global capitalism. The argument, though not always stated, is that these protests will, through some inexplicable mechanism of combination, produce a revolutionary critical mass at some point on the distant horizon that will finally resolve the communist hypothesis. This is precisely what is now called movementism.
Yeah.
And I can't disagree with that analysis. Watching people be radicalized and mobilized around the WTO and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then seeing those things be repressed and fizzled out. Watching the Occupy movement spontaneously erupt and then fizzle out. Watching the BLM movement, and then I would say that culminated with the murder of George Floyd in the protests in 2020, just to fizzle out. Like, we see this time and time again where, and even on the show, we've asked, like, there's revolutionary potential here. What is happening to these movements because they just fizzle out? And he's saying, like, we can't continue to get caught up in this tailism where we're chasing these spontaneous movements that have no organized intention and expect them to come out the other side with some communist utopia, you know?
You know, which, like, is on its face just clear, you know? Thinking about the whole strategy of, like, just pluralism, get everyone together, say you do, and then even just in the purest hypothetical, right? The big fucking protest happens and somehow the government dissolves. Mm-hmm. Then what? You know, there's no communist outcome of that because there's no communist leadership. There's no communist direction.
Communist direction. Get your mind out of the gutter. Yeah.
Right? It's a void, essentially. And what he says is that, you know, since politics abhors the void, if we do it unconsciously, it will simply enact the politic that was before, right? It will enact capitalism again. And I think that he makes a great point there. We've talked plenty about the tyranny of structurelessness. And so this idea that we'll just have all of these separate groups out there together doesn't actually have a plan for what is to be done with these groups. No joke intended there, so sorry. And so, I don't know, it's just kind of laughable. It's very much, like, it's crazy because it feels common sense to say, like, yeah, the more people, the better. But without actual movement and leadership behind it, I don't see how you could ever think that would do anything, unless you just say, we'll get everyone together and then strikingly some democratic process will happen and we'll come to the conclusion then. That assumes so many things that it's impossible.
Yeah, not even to mention the monopoly of violence that the state holds there. And so without an organized intention on what is even the response to that predictable violence going to be, how can you expect anything to come of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a critique that he levies at a lot of left communists because, especially in the framing of the Invisible Committee, when he talks about the coming insurrection, he says very clearly, ever since 1917, every single insurrection has been put down by the state. Why pretend otherwise?
Yeah.
To act like an insurrection is enough simply is to fool yourself. It's simply to ignore the history that's already happened. To say it's just some popular uprising even is enough. I mean, the thing is like, that's it. We're not uprising-ists. We're revolutionaries. The point is to create revolution, not just to create an uprising, a rebellion, whatever. Mm-hmm. It's to create a moment where the communist necessity is realized, right? Because even in the sense of what might bring movements together, the things that bring movements together aren't revolutionary. They're immediate. They're immediate concerns, right? Like the George Floyd protests, right? Were all centered around immediate concerns of police brutality. And you can really see how the goalposts were shifted as we moved along. It's not that the needs were met, Jesus Christ, but different parts of the movement were able to be ameliorated essentially to the point where the movement was dissolved.
Yeah.
The strike was broken. The demands, quote unquote, were met, even though I know they weren't, because just look at it. And everyone went back to work.
Yeah, and the great irony to that is that it's always a pendulum swing. To say that the needs were met is really just a way of saying that the protesters were repressed strongly enough that an even stronger response than what they were protesting follows. It's fucking gross. You had mentioned before we started recording the episode a reference to the Paris Commune, and I've been thinking about that while we've been talking about this specifically. Like, yeah, how can we expect to get to some sort of communist reality out of a spontaneous movement? We can't even get to the fucking Paris Commune.
Right. Yeah. I mean, hey, we had Chaz. We had the Chaz chop.
Okay.
Sorry. It is depressing.
Yeah.
The point that Paul makes is very clear, is that movementism is past. He said something here that was interesting to me. The charge of sectarianism is also meant to imply that the, quote, sectarians are dogmatists, and in some cases this is indeed correct. But the very fact they are being charged with sectarianism because they are refusing to abide by what is intended to be a hegemonic doctrine is due to their unwillingness to declare fidelity to movementism, right? So the idea that we can, like, just in the same way that Paul wants us to study the failures of previous revolutions in order to learn, we can also apply that to the movements that just happened. In the 90s and 2000s, movementism was practiced. It was put into practice, right? It affected the masses and the people, and it failed, right? It had its own limits. It had its own restrictions. That, too, should be analyzed in the same way. We don't need to keep adhering to this kind of movementist struggle because we can analyze what happened to it already. And so I think there's just something really interesting that Paul is saying there about the fact that it's not dogmatic for us to reject these things because we're simply making an analysis of what already happened. We're building the line in that sense. We're rejecting this line because we know based on the analysis, based on the praxis, that it doesn't necessarily work. We know what it leads to.
Yeah, my response to that, I wrote a little note to myself here in response to this, like a treatise against 21st century movementism, that I feel a little bit to blame. Call it lazy, call it ill-informed ignorance, but I am not keen on such, quote, sectarian squabbling. I've often said we'll sort that out when the time comes. But his whole point about a unified theory is a valid one. Like, we'll never develop the theory beyond 20th century, quote unquote, failures if we can't settle on the theory in the first place. And so that quote unquote squabbling that's happening is being seen as a rejection of movementism, and we're being called sectarian for that. But he's like, we learned this lesson so many fucking times. How many times do we need to keep having this conversation?
Well, it's interesting too, because movementism it's an aggregate of a bunch of separate identities. And I think that it kind of slips under the radar because people are more willing to accept those separate identities as the focus. Just even thinking about identity politics, we're not talking about any particular identity when we think about identity politics, but the practice of using your identity as the politic, right? Movementism is the same way. It's not that these movements are not important in their own right. Most of them, many of them. You know what I'm saying. It's the fact that the idea of focusing many small cells of movements and trying to group them together is not advantageous to us, right? It's a practice that doesn't bring us anything.
Yeah, because like he says, when you bring all those disparate groups together, the only unifying theory you have is some vague anti-capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. There's no unity there. There's actually not a revolutionary unity. It's not the unity we're looking to create.
The only other thing I had to talk about really is just kind of to talk about the quote-unquote failures of communism in the past and the need to reframe conversations like that, because that is inherently like to accept the, what did you call it, the totalizing anti-communist rhetoric that we get. He throws out a couple of bits starting on 102. He's talking obviously primarily about Russia and China when he's talking about this. Okay, so when communists in the modern day are asking for us to consider the historical reality of communist projects in the past, he says, this is not a demand to return to the particular communism that was practiced directly after the October Revolution in 1917, or even to the particular communism that was practiced in the course of the Chinese Revolution under Mao. The most obvious problem of making such a demand is the fact that these revolutions did fail. And though we should not comprehend these failures according to an end of history discourse that forbids memory, we should recognize that there were important truths established in these revolutions, hard won by the struggles of past revolutionaries. We should not fetishize the possibility of perfect repetition. And he continues that on 105. I just love the way that he put this.
It's a fantastic quote.
The failures of both the Russian and Chinese revolutions were catastrophic because they fell from such great heights. They had accomplished so much, unleashing the world historical potential of the masses, only to collapse. And I think anytime you talk to non-communists about Russia or China, well, number one, they don't know anything about China. Number two, you talk to them about Russia, they're thinking of it in a particularly bourgeois way. And it's like a totalizing thing. They have an inability to recognize how fucking monumental that revolution was.
Sure.
What it did bring. And I don't know, I think we often also kind of get lost in that, where, I don't know, I kind of see it in two camps. People that are like, the instructions are written, you do it like this, and it's seen as prescriptive and not applied to the material reality of the context in which they're speaking, which is obviously false. Or two, it's like, well, what's the point of that? It failed. In fact, this morning, I watched the first couple of minutes of a clip from a live stream that Anarch did. I've been reading his books, which are not convincing me to be an anarchist, I'll say that. But his kind of whole line of thinking was like, MLs are wrong because look at the data, 98% of communist revolutions have failed. And he's like, how are they trying to tell you that a 98% failure rate is somehow the guide for a successful revolution? And, and that just comes from such a bad faith, disingenuous position. But so many people hold it. Yeah. Even, I think, communists to a certain degree are like...
We do the same thing. I mean, I remember talking about council communism and saying the same thing. Your best example of successful council communism was in 1918 and then obliterated. Or something like that, so we do the same thing. It's very funny to judge communism based on its successes when it is a history of mostly failure.
Yeah. That's why I think that reframing is important, because it is... These projects have failed, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to examine why these projects have failed. Not even failed, have been defeated.
Is exactly what I was going to say, Because that's the thing. It's like there is a sense in which that's a failure because it couldn't defend itself.
Which in fairness, I've said that about anarchism many times. So
Right. So I'm happy to acknowledge that. But I don't know, even just to continue that quote, man, on 105, he says it right at the bottom. Whereas capitalism is a catastrophe because of its success, communism was a catastrophe because its successes were overthrown by its eventual failures.
Yeah.
And I don't know, man. It's just that, like, that's proof that a better world is possible. Like, that's the thing. And, like, even to put it in the context of necessity, that's proof that the communist necessity can be realized. The communist necessity was realized in Russia, the necessity to overthrow the Tsar. The communist necessity was realized in China, the necessity for the people to stand up. You know, it's about learning from what it took for those things to realize the communist necessity and then applying it to the same thing. I mean, just like he says later on when he's talking about, just as you said on that quote on 140, right? It's not about the dogmatic reassertion, but a return to the living science. We're taking that living science and we're applying it to the current circumstances. It's not dogmatic. It's not formulaic. It's about understanding the material reality. It's about analyzing the contradictions, and it's about creating the conditions for the people to realize the necessity of communism in its immediacy.
Yeah, and that I love that quote on 140, and it kind of relates back to this, like, so the answer is just another party kind of rhetoric that we've been spouting a little bit, because he says all returns are always new, as Lenin learned when he creatively applied Marxism to his social context, as Mao learned when he creatively applied Marxism-Leninism to his social context, and those of us who understand that communism must be understood as a necessity are trying to learn when we return to these past developments of necessity with a perspective that is always new because society changes, you know? That alchemy of synthesis in the material world always makes it something new.
Yeah.
It's always birthing something new.
And also, just want to say, he does mention Stalin too, and he does it on the sly, which I think he like slips it in there. He's like, even Stalin, guys, even Stalin, you know. But it's that same thing. It's about applying that kind of revolutionary science to the current context, right? Stalin was given a situation where Stalin is in the context of applying the Leninist model to the current situation of Russia, right? And so we also seek to learn from that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know, man.
All right, the cavalcade of quotes. Oh, dude. So many of his takedowns of the kind of movementist movements, I don't know what, so many of his takedowns of movementism are so fucking acerbic. They're so good. On 17, talking about the response to the G20 and the like protests around that, they had already dampened their expectations, and when they spoke of winning, they were simply demonstrating a defeatist acceptance of lowered stakes. And even goes on the next page, they are willing to settle for reformism and pretend that it is revolution, acting as if a successful defense of the right to assembly and the ability to make one's complaint heard are the only victories the movement can achieve. God damn. That's good.
Yeah.
Sharp.
Definitely. I will say that he does talk a little bit about the EZLN, the Zapatista movement in Mexico. And it's not necessarily to put it down. He still says it's worthy of study, but it's interesting to compare the reception of the Zapatistas to the Shining Path in Peru. And I think that something he says that's so interesting is, well, really, he draws it as a parallel to, like, movements that still realize communism as a necessity versus the kind of normative anarchism is what he says. And I think that the EZLN is such an interesting case study there because of exactly what he says, right? There was that kind of refusal to seize state power in the same way, whereas that was the goal of Shining Path. And you can see what happened to those groups moving forward based on those positions. The Zapatistas are still allowed to function essentially in the south of Mexico. I am not knowledgeable enough to say firmly where they stand. Just being completely honest, you know, I have immense respect for them. I'm not hiding that.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's not to say that their position is necessarily ideal. It's just interesting to compare the two, I think. And I'm not necessarily for the show, but I am interested in learning more about the Shining Path ever since we read Guerrilla Warfare, honestly, because I got a little bit more of that case study. And Gonzalo is always hung heavy on my mind because he's such a meme figure. Like, more study is required on Gonzalo and the PCB.
Yeah. Back to our conversation about sectarianism on 56, right under the maladjusted troglodytes line. He says, indeed, if endorsing a principled and politically different revolutionary ideology was the measure of sectarianism, then Marx and Engels would have to be sectarian for daring to wage an ideological line struggle against the other and utopian socialist approaches that threatened to mislead the movement in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Imagine that, the first sectarians, Marx and Engels.
You know, it just keeps going back to that thing, and I think I'm just more and more realizing when we talked about, I think this was on the Anarchist Primer episode, and it was just about how Marx was so fervent in calling Bakunin a pedophile the whole time.
Yeah.
And it's like, maybe he was right, you know? Maybe he was... Like, I'm just thinking about the fact that he says, like, why do we keep trying to rehash all these old battles when we're ignoring, like, the real ideological war that happened to already create these differences, you know? Like, he talks about looking at prehistory as something communistic when Marx and Engels chose communism as a word to specifically differentiate themselves from the kind of utopian socialisms of the past, you know, not necessarily talking about prehistory, but I just think it's really interesting the way that we, and also we broadly, still end up rehashing a lot of those old conversations, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, part of that, like I was thinking about the context of this show in the context of this book. Sorry for double context there. But part of it is that I do need to learn it, you know? Like part of it is that I need to understand this stuff in order to be able to understand it. I mean, I need to... What a stupid sentence.
You got to know to apply it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I have to know it to apply it. And so... there's part of me that still does need to rehash those old arguments for the purposes of settling them again, but it's not that they aren't already settled. That's the thing. It's that I need to see the settling, you know, it's for lack of better words there.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah, I don't know. Just a little bit of covering my own ass since I love to explore the niche. I can't help it. I'm sorry.
Well, this is maybe broadly related, but something that really struck me here on 64, he brings up Debeau and the Situationist International. I guess there's not really a quote so much, but to during we can add Guy Debord and Situationism, a theory that crystallized during the Paris Rebellion in 1968 and that is still beloved by those activists obsessed with vague theoretical praxis such as culture jamming, psychogeography, and other abstract concepts that are compelling because of their obscurantism. And though Debord might have had no significant impact on concrete struggle, even in the context from which he emerged, he is worth mentioning because so many of these new attempts at reclaiming communism often speak his name. And I am both fascinated and frustrated by this level of intellectualizing, right? Like Debord, obviously, the first time I read Society of the Spectacle, it really spoke to me, but there are other parts of it that almost felt like cork sniffing, which I think allows too much allowance, you know, gives too much room for intellectuals to get away with endlessly theorizing without action, what George Jackson would rightly call cowards. Yeah. So like, I feel like there's a weird balance there for someone that's new to it. Like you said on this show, the whole point is that we're reading all of this stuff, exploring all of this to try to reach a deeper understanding for ourselves, because you can't be at the front if you don't understand where you're going. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like, the spectacle as a concept born from alienation, I think that has theoretical value, but a lot of it also, the book also kind of feels like the left talking to the left about the left. You know what I mean?
I think a lot. I mean, I think that you're speaking to the core issue I've had with a lot of the philosophy we've read, you know, and it's not that it doesn't hold merit, but much in the same way, I think that I was talking about an analyzing movementism as a whole practice. I think much of the same kind of analysis can be derived from something like critical philosophy. You know, like looking at the Frankfurt School as an example, he makes a great point where despite all of their philosophizing and talk about what was happening with Marxism and Western Marxism post-World War II, they still reached the limits of their theory, essentially. They still, in their praxis, ended up doing things that were outright reactionary. I mean, fucking Marcuse was working with the CIA, man.
Yeah.
Like, shit like that. Like,
yeah, he calls out the Frankfurt School a couple of times.
Yeah. I love in the beginning when he says that decades of critical philosophy have made us cynical. But that's sometimes how it really feels reading that stuff, where it's like, I'm just endlessly philosophizing, intellectualizing, this kind of thing. But I think that there is something to be gained from it. It's just... it needs to be taken hand in hand with an analysis of its limits also. And I think that that's just the best way to approach it. I do like reading some of that critical philosophy stuff, critical theory, but I can't lie that it's tough, man. I mean, I think every time about when we try to read...
We fucking gave up on Adorno.
Yeah, we gave up on Adorno. And it's not that it's not useful, it's just that it wasn't anything at the moment, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure I could go back and read it at some point, but like, I don't know what I'm going to get from it.
Yeah.
You know, slamming a car door is fascist, okay? Sorry, I don't mean to vulgarize Adorno so badly.
I don't know. That's just a manifestation of the fear of how separated you can become from the people. Fucking Adorno is never going to be mobilizing the masses. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
but I mean, okay, I was about to say, but like, you know, Marcuse was kind of though, but not really. That's the thing, is that was he really mobilizing the masses per se, or was he reclaiming communism for the middle class milieu? You know? Yeah. So I don't know.
I just feel worse and worse.
It's a great book, guys. It's a great book.
Okay, well, I guess I would close with the last line of the text on 147. By re-articulating the theoretical weapons of the past now, by creatively reasserting universality in today's particular instances, we will remember everything we were taught to forget. And in this remembering, painful as it might be, we will find ourselves standing on the shores of necessity.
Hell yeah.
That's banging.
Hell yeah.
There it was.
The communist necessity. What questions did this leave you with, Aaron?
I did leave a few for myself. I mean, the one that I mentioned at the top of the show, like who will be the vanguard of the West in the 21st century, I think that still stands. And the other questions I'm left with are more pragmatic. Like, I want to know more about People's War in India. Apparently, Walking with the Comrades is a book recommendation that I picked up from this text, so I'd like to look into that. Yeah. And I don't know who the Invisible Committee is. Who is the Invisible Committee? Does it matter? Those are my questions.
No, I'm sorry to say that this kind of put the nail in my left comm coffin before we read any left comm material. This is not a program is by Tikken, which he polemicizes heavily against here. And so that kind of makes me feel a lot shittier about those, sorry to say, because that's kind of my question there too, is like, what are the limits of those kinds of movements? I guess it's, sorry to say, I guess it's dialectical. There's something there. No, I know. I really appreciated this book. I'm curious what other works from Paul are worth reading. If you're a big JMP fan and you've read Continuity and Rupture, or
that's the one I put on my list.
Yeah, I'm curious in an anti-revisionist Maoist perspective in the modern context. I've only grown more sympathetic to modern China, so
same.
If you feel the need to stop that where it stands, you can let us know with some recommendations, as well as any other feedback, comments, concerns. leftandrightfeedback@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm. We accidentally skipped the introduction to this, but you should read this if...
You go first. You go first.
Well, the two I wrote for myself before we started recording, I don't feel as strongly about now, but you should read this if you feel unsatisfied with the state of communist organization today. Because you'll at least get to commiserate in the complete lack of organization. The other one, probably the one that is a little more relevant, you should read this if you've ever wondered, why didn't blank fill-in spontaneous movement ever develop into a larger movement?
Yeah, I think that's a great one. You should definitely read this if you feel unsatisfied with if you don't have language to describe the movementism of the last 30 years, this is a great book for that. And I think it does a great job at not only labeling it, but also at disassembling it. I also think you should read this if you need your anti-revisionist fire stoked. That's not a bad one.
Yeah.
Maybe you find yourself slipping into the dangest, into the dangest variety. JMP is there for you.
Yeah.
What are we reading next?
Next, we're going to read Critique of the Gotha Program, a return to Marx.
Yeah, throwing it back a little bit. We're going to... Pardon me. We're returning to the classics here, and I think this one will be interesting because it's Marx's critique of an actual application of socialist theory, in given the time. So I think that'll be interesting. I know he talks about labor notes in this one.
Mm-hmm. We haven't read any Marx since we finished Capital, and I'm feeling a yearning. So
yeah, we got a giant textbook of Marx.
Yeah.
If you're interested in the same edition, we got the Grapevine edition, the complete works.
It's fucking huge.
It's not complete either.
Yeah, not even close.
I wasn't expecting a complete edition or anything, but yeah, it's fucking gigantic. So
yeah, grab your copy of the complete works of Marx.
And don't get left unread, y'all.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.